I want to do a little bit of a follow-up, see where CRU is at. Have they learned anything from the past several years, or are they continuing down the same path? Now, I wasn't completely sure where I was going to go to do that follow-up. I had one document that I got in an email from CRU that sounded questionable. When I was reading it over my initial, first look, it was pretty mild, to say the least, until I got a little bit further down and I started to see things that were a little bit more questionable. And I started to look into context. What is this that's being presented? What is the source for this? And yeah, they're quoting a critical race theorist. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Enemies Within the Church podcast. You can go to EWTCnews.com. That stands for Enemies Within the Church News. EWTCnews.com to, you can view the documentary if you haven't already. You can also buy a copy for yourself, your friend, all your friends. Go wild with it. You can also see some of the articles that we put out over time. It's our continued project. This podcast is part of that. You can also, if you want to support the podcast, see it continue in its current form, or have some input on changes you'd like to see, you can go down in the description and support the podcast via its Patreon. You can also, it will likely be down there. I'm going to try and get it down there. I'm doing multiple things all at the same time on a very tight week. But you can go to our Give, Send, Go as well. You can donate to that monthly or just one-time donations. That's going to be the best place for those one-time donations if you would like to support the podcast. Like I've said before, that is specifically going to me for my work on the podcast so that I can do the podcast. It's not for enemies within the church as a whole. We're trying to work on some larger documentary projects, and we don't have the funds to dedicate for podcasting or even for the work I do on the website. So if you would like to see those things continue, like to support them, that's a great way to give. We're also continuing our little bit of challenge that I put out for the month of October here. Pick your favorite episode. Let me know what it is. I want to hear your feedback. Hey, this was a good episode. It really helped me understand X and Y. I want to know, I want to hear that feedback, but also take your favorite episode, the one that was really helpful or useful to you, and share that with someone. Share that with someone. If it was helpful for you, then presumably be helpful for someone else. So go ahead and share that with someone. That's the challenge for the month of October as I'm trying to gauge exactly the direction to take the podcast, because we don't have as much time for the podcast. We don't have as much resources for the podcast. And I need some of that feedback to know where to best put my time. What are we talking about, though? What are we talking about? Well, as I mentioned in the intro, we're talking about CRU, doing a little bit of a revisit. Where are they now? Where's CRU at now? Have they learned anything over the past few years, or are they continuing to push, wokeness? Are they continuing to push ideas like critical race theory, queer theory, so on and so forth? These ideas that are rooted not in the Word of God, but rooted in Marxist ideas, or at least taking those ideas and morphing them into a sort of Christianized version. That's the question. Are they still pursuing this path? Now, we've reported on CRU before. We've talked about them, looked at their material, and asked questions about it. And that's what we're going to do today. So this document that we're going to pull up here comes from... Now, if you don't know about CRU, you might know it as formerly Campus Crusade for Christ. You might know it as a college ministry, but it is so much more than that. It is a global missions, juggernaut. And it has many ministries or sub-ministries, whatever you want to say there, that are a part of it. So this comes from an email that I was sent by CRU, and this is part of their Family Life Ministry. Now, what Family Life is, it's a ministry about marriage and family. So that already becomes a little bit strange when you understand what this is, because it is, as I pull it up for those who are watching, it's a document called "How to Comfort a Friend: Racial Trauma." Now again, why is that coming up for family life? Why is that coming up in and um, a marriage and family ministry? It seems a little bit of the wrong place, and that's what first really piqued my interest, was this idea of out of placeness that it had to it. So as I get this pulled up onto the screen for those who are watching the video version of the podcast, and people listening on audio, I think you know by now, I'm going to be reading everything. I'm going to be explaining everything. But if I ever don't, leave me a comment. Leave me a comment. And you can do that on the audio version now. You can do that on specifically the Spotify version. You can leave comments. So if I just start rambling on about something, assuming you're seeing it, call me out on it. Okay, I need to be held accountable. So this is document "How to Comfort a Friend: Racial Trauma." Now, we're not going to read the whole thing. It isn't that long, so we're going to read a fair bit of it. But let's get the context. What are they talking about? What is racial trauma? Now, there's another question I want to put out there. Why is this important for marriage and families? I'm going to spoil it right off the bat. That question is not going to be addressed in this. But let's read. Here's their definition. Racial trauma: it's the holistic response people of color experience due to persistent acts of discrimination, bias, and even hate. Racial trauma and its aftermath are a destructive force to families and generations around the world. I mean, you can say there they said the word family, but it's not really what they're talking about. And you're going to see in the body it's not there. Like other kinds of trauma, it can cause powerful physical and emotional responses. I already really don't like this for comparing someone being offended by something, a perceived offense. We're going to get into that. Are they talking about actual offense or perceived offense? But I don't like that they're connecting it to real trauma, because people experience real trauma in this world. And it's not insults. There are people that have experienced horrifying things that no one should experience. There are people that, first responders, medical personnel, law enforcement, fire rescue, military as well, they see things that we shouldn't have to see. And they have to experience it, and they have to process it. And there's people that go through that. You want a good example of people that do experience real trauma, you can go support our sister ministry, Equipping the Persecuted, where Enemies Within the Church director, Judd Saul, he goes to Nigeria and he helps persecuted Christians. And they have experienced real trauma. And what does trauma mean? Well, it means that you got attacked by a group of terrorists. You were violently sexually violated. You were hacked at with a machete. You had to watch your family members get butchered, rest of your village get butchered. You had to watch horrors. That's trauma. Now, does that mean that emotional things can't deeply wound someone? No, that's not what we're talking about at all. But I already don't like it that it's trying to link it to deeper traumatic incidents. I mean, we are unambiguously talking about offense here. But then there's the other thing. It's the holistic response people of color experience due to persistent acts of discrimination, bias, and even hate. It's not just people in general, it's whatever people of color is. I mean, it's capitalized here, capital P, capital C, people of color. It's apparently being used as a proper noun. But what is that? What is a people of color? It's a question I will ask every time it comes up. Just like when people bring up the term white, what is it? White? Do you even know who is in and who is out? Or are you just turning it into a construct that you can shove whatever you want in there? A bit of a confirmation bias there. But you can see it's one dimensional. Only one group of people is included in racial trauma. You can see that they're already boxing this into a specific ideology. It's not just some sort of general trauma around skin color. It's specifically monodirectional, done to people of color, whoever makes it into that category or not. Now, let's read a little bit through this. So the first part of this is going to be very just super generic, super mild, and just bad advice. Just bad advice. I'll try not to go too deep into it, but it just frustrates me how bad of advice it is. So things, you're supposed to pause before you respond. You're supposed to establish trust, then extend the invitation. If you feel comfortable, I'd like to understand what happened to you. Would you feel like telling me your story? And one thing CRU is, I've read so many things from CRU, and all of their things are so contrived and just bad. People don't talk like this. If someone's read that off to me, I'd feel uneasy. I'd be like, I wouldn't trust the person. I wouldn't feel like they care. You actually have to have a relationship with someone, and you actually have to talk with them like a human being. But the first point I want to kind of focus in on is validate their experience. Now, I want to say something. If you're coming up to someone who says, "Hey, man, this thing happened to me, and it's really affecting me," you do want to connect with them. You don't want the first thing that comes out of your mouth to be, "Well, did that actually happen or not?" Yeah, you don't want that to be the first thing, but you don't want to validate their experience, because it's not about their experience. Experiences lie, emotions lie. How we respond to things isn't always correct. So we don't want to validate their experience. We want to actually listen to them. It's ironic. They talk about the need to listen to people, but validating someone's experience isn't listening to them. It's coming in with a bias. Now, it's a, quote, positive bias, because you're assuming what they're saying is true, but that's not helpful. Excuse me. So let's read this. That sounds horrible. I hate that this happened to you. Express your gratitude that your friend trusted you with this story of vulnerability. No. Simple. If you're going to come to someone, actually listen to them. Have them express what's going on, and then dive into it. Dive into the circumstance. Dive into the situation. It's going to take a little bit of time if they're really offended by something. If it seems like something really wounded them, silence is honestly better than anything else. Giving them some supportive silence is going to be so much better than contrived fake support. And then once you give them, you build that trust, get that silence in there, start to get the conversation rolling, because generally people don't want to talk about something that truly actually hurt them. So give them some silence, get the conversation rolling, let them start it. Once it gets a little momentum, start to dive into things. But what's the points of diving in that they have? Well, let's read this. More than to dissect the situation, ask questions to truly understand what? Understand their experience in their shoes. Well, their experience is connected to the situation. Beyond that, the questions that we're about to read are all questions about dissecting the situation. The problem is they're giving you a bias and then saying it's not a bias. The bias is you assume that the person's experience is authoritative, is correct regardless of the circumstance, and that the only thing that matters is the person's uh, perception of the event. Questions you're supposed to ask are things like, what was that like for you? What did you feel in that moment? What do you wish you could have said? I mean, again, these are just contrived questions. They're not how you should or would actually talk to someone. What was going through your mind? How do you think and feel about that afterwards? And what situations do you avoid going through that, if any? What do you wish they would have done differently? Would you feel comfortable telling me more? Okay, never ask that question. Like, you're just trying to general advice. Don't ask that kind of question. Have a conversation with the person like they're an actual person, like they're an adult that can make their own decisions, that you don't need to uh, talk to in this patronizing way. And that's what frustrates me about this is stuff like this. Putting it in the context of skin color, which is frustrating in itself, but it's how to talk to. I mean, basically, this is um, white people's guide to how to talk down to a black person, because that's what it is. You're treating the way they're presenting this is you're talking to the other person like you would a small child. No, they are a competent adult that is able to communicate with you. Or even if they're a teenager, they're competent. They can communicate with you. They can speak. If they don't want to speak, then they won't speak. You're going to have an actual human conversation with them. I'm sorry, it's just contrived advice frustrates me because it's not helpful. Then you're supposed to affirm your friend's God-given worth. And again, this goes into the super contrived category. Your culture, heritage, and race were treated like they were a weakness or something to be looked down on. But to me, they give you so much strength. I know more about God's character because I know you as a person who bears his image. Uh, what, what are we doing to people? I hope you know that you are, in every part of you, is deeply valuable to me and this world. And what has happened is in no way okay. So, again, talking about not dissecting a situation, you're supposed to say the situation was wrong and that it was racism and that your perceived experience is correct. Your perception is correct. Your experience is valid. All this is, you're just assuming it. You're biasing yourself on their side, which is not healthy to them. I know the best advice I've ever got is generally advice where it challenges me and it challenges my perception of a situation. This is, again, talking down to people. Continuing on, encourage them to take the space they need to grieve and heal. How have you been coping with this? How have you found ways to talk about this and deal in ways that help? One thing I want to say, you're not there in the contrived circumstance they're presenting. You're not there to help the person at all. You're there for venting. Now, sometimes people need to get out their frustration before they can actually have a conversation. And if you're ever going to talk with a hurting person, that's going to happen. Sometimes you're even going to talk to someone that's going to lash out at you. They're going to take it out on you. Now, the advice here would be then, oh, I'm supposed to just get offended because my experience of offense is what matters. No. I once had a friend who was struggling, I'm not going to go into it, but he's just struggling in a bunch of different ways. And he was handling it very poorly. And he was starting to lash out at people who were there trying to help him and be supportive of him. But because they were the people that were close to him, they were the people that got lashed out against. I had to, for his sake, stand my ground. By standing my ground, I was just like, no, he demanded I apologize for something that didn't happen. I was there. We were having a good conversation, and I was lending him my ear. I was giving him not necessarily advice, but I was like, hey, I'm here to help you with this. I'm here to be supportive. I'm here, and talking in details about what that means and talking about what's going on. And I had to stand my ground because he demanded an apology, because he took offense to something that I didn't even say, didn't happen, wasn't anywhere in there. He was looking for offense, created an offense, and lashed out at me to the point where he said, you either give me an apology or you're walking yourself home, because he had given me a ride. And I looked at him and said, I love you. I'm here for you. I'm going to support you. And that's why I'm going to walk myself home right now. Because I can't lie to you. I can't say sorry for something that didn't happen. And I just want to make sure you understand, reflect on what I said, because I'm here for you, man. And I walked myself home. I got a text later that night. He said, hey, I was wrong. I realized what you were saying. I realized you were trying to help me. And I need people like that in my life. Like I said, I don't want to go too far down the advice route. So let's get moving on, because I think you want to know about how CRU is doing. But let's so they talk about advice like, oh, if it becomes too hard to listen to your friend, which is weird, but they're making some assumptions. The assumptions will start to become more obvious, but they're making the assumption that you, as a white person, are going to find you're going to be blind to racism and not understand the systemic racism that people of color experience. That's the assumption. We're going to see that assumption down here, but just understand that when you read this. If it feels hard to believe someone so different from your, or if it feels hard to believe something so different from your own experience, realize your reality may be very different from your friends. Consider how you could continue learning about experiences like theirs. Again, it's all experience centric. It's experience centric. It's not rooted in truth, the truth of what's going on. You're not actually there to help someone because you're there to just reaffirm their offense. You're there to say you are justified feeling the way you are, and you are encouraged to continue to feel the way you are. Continuing on, but know that silencing differences contributes to, pay attention to this, but know that silencing differences contributes to unjust situations continuing. We don't want to keep people with different thoughts and experiences on the outside of our relational circles. That's a problem. But know that silencing differences contributes to unjust situations continuing. Now, what does that mean? In the context of what we're talking about, it means that if you refuse to listen to your friend and validate their experience, that you are silencing differences and contributing to unjust situations continuing. I mean, what was a popular Black Lives Matter phrase during 2020? White silence is white violence. That is functionally the same sort of thing they're saying there. That you just want to ignore systemic racism and bury your head in the sand and silence. You want to silence the voices of these people of color. You're contributing to this. That's so wrong. Again, that's very condescending. It's wrong. Continuing on, particularly as Christians, none of us can say, I don't need you. When one of us suffers, we all suffer. 1 Corinthians 12:21 through 26. Now that the end, when one of us suffers, we all suffer. That is included in 1 Corinthians 12:21 through 26. It's talking about the body being made of many parts, and you can't, you can't reject any of the parts. And then it says, when one part suffers, all suffer. When one is glorified, all are glorified. But that's not perceived suffering. Again, go back to it's our brothers and sisters in Nigeria are suffering massively. And that should grieve us. But it's not talking about personal offense. That's not what it's talking about. It's not talking about, oh, I got my feelings hurt, therefore the entire body of Christ is now suffering with me. It's also talking about the idea of support, that we have the whole body. It's just some minor scripture twisting and applying it wrong. But it's still important to note that. Now, here's where it really goes off the rails. I saw this quote. Now, the quote in itself is very problematic. So let's just read it. But then I looked up the quote, and it gets significantly worse. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. I'm going to just point it out right out. That's so unchristian. So unbiblical, so unchristian. That is so contradictory. That blatantly violates 1 Corinthians 12:21 through 26. That is a part of the body saying, I don't need you. All you're supposed to do is validate me. So wrong. If you come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Now, this quote has become, this is from an Aboriginal Australian activist, Lila Watson. Lila Watson. I need to change up how my screen is facing me so I can read it more straight on. But this in Australian social justice circles, from what I understand, this is a little bit of a rallying cry for all the different social justice categories, whether it's the LGBT movement, the radical feminist movement, or others. That's the kind of, hey, the liberation of women, because she's combining, specifically, she's talking about the liberation of women and the liberation of Aboriginals. And binding those two together. And she's also talking to white people that you're allowed to come along for the ride. Now, can I justify that? Yes, I can. We're going to look at that. But it's 100%. It's critical race theory. Well, it's just general critical theory. And the ideas of liberating from our oppressors. I mean, our only oppressor is ourselves and the sin that we have in our lives. Our liberator is Christ, not perceived injustice. But I thought this is a weird quote, very weird quote, very thrown in here. Who is this woman? And why is she being quoted? Well, one, I don't see any evidence that she is Christian. Now, I only looked so much into her, but it seems to be a secular source. That's very strange. But maybe there's some truth there, but it doesn't seem to be truth. So what's the context of this quote? Well, this comes from a 2004 speech that she gave. And we're going to read the section where this quote is given. The section title is Challenges to Whites. Many white fellas who got involved found themselves on a steep learning curve. They had regarded themselves as normal, But as France Fanon said, in a racist society, it is normal to be racist. So right there, she's saying systemic racism. That the only normal thing for white people in this racist society is racism. So they had to confront their own racism and that of their community, and to recognize the persisting colonial perceptions, attitudes, and relationships which underpin it. Some had difficulty recognizing their paternalism. In Brisbane, we used a slogan: "If you come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Many realized that they knew nothing about Murray's, the tribe that she's part of, their history, their culture, and how their community functioned, but came to realize that they needed some of this knowledge if their contributions were to be effective. They had to learn, often from their mistakes, how to consult with the community in an appropriate way, how to work with rather than for people. So I am blatantly pushing a critical race theory narrative, of an idea of just inherent systemic racism, that if you are a white fella in this system, that you are inherently racist and you can't come alongside until you confront that. So that's disturbing, that's included in here. But let's continue on. In How to Respond with Compassion When Someone is Hurt by Racism, authors Trin Mai and Jean Whitlock explain there are general responses that would leave the wound uncared for. This echoes Jeremiah 6:14. Jeremiah 6:14 it's about to be quoted, has nothing to do with this. They have healed the wound of my people lightly, saying, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. Unless they're using that verse in context, which would be so bad, because I mean, in that case, they're saying that, again, white people are saying peace, peace when there is no peace, that they're bringing war. Again, this is why I was comfortable bringing up the idea of white silence is white violence, because if they're applying that to this verse to the ideas that they're doing, that you're just trying to cover up the issue instead of healing the issue, well, that's problematic to say the least. But I mean, with this article, I thought about including a little bit of it, reading a little bit. I don't think we really need to, but it's from a University of Utah Health, and it's going over racism in the medical field, and they provide an example. Well, let's just read this part. It seems to be, I can't tell if it's a real story or a contrived one. I don't know. It's definitely, put into the context of the article, not just it's presented as is. So, scenario 1, a bedside nurse's experience of racism. So it's saying experience of racism. Guaranteed it is racism. I left with a knot in my gut. I walked in the door and greeted my patient. She returned my smile. I introduced myself as her nurse for the day shift. Her smile quickly shifted. She asked me, "You're an RN? How much experience do you have? Where did you go to school?" I felt awkward, but answered her barrage of questions and tried to reassure her of my qualifications and intentions to provide her the care she deserves. After completing my tasks, I left her room with a knot in my gut. Did she question me because I am a black woman? Well, there's your first problem. You're going immediately to assumptions, and making race part of it. Could it have been? Who knows? There's definitely not enough context here. Did she question me because I look young? But there are many nurses that are younger than I am on this unit. But they're not interacting with her. You are. At midshift, the charge nurse informed me that she is reassigning another nurse to this patient. The family had made the request stating that it just wasn't a good fit. I felt sick to my stomach and started to wonder if it even belonged in this profession. I'm sorry, but if you're so put off by something like that, and it goes on, her experience of just woe is me because of this racism, and how she can't talk to anyone else because they're all white. If that's how you respond to a situation like this, I can't help you. I can't help you. The context seems to be helping an elderly person. I'm really curious. What was the age of the nurse that was reassigned? I know a lot of elderly people look at young medical professionals with great suspicion. They look at someone who's half their age and they go, "Oh, you're just a baby. You can't be fully trained. You don't have the experience." Especially older people generally value experience much more than degrees and education. So they're going to look at, do you have the experience? Have you been through uh, all these things? Do you know how to actually respond? Or do you just have that book training? But there's not enough context there. You just assume it's racism is really problematic. So it's just showing the quality of the article. The article is very much just, we're going to assume it's racism, and then we're going to build an entire world off that. And this tiny little interaction is world shattering. And it should be world shattering. We have to address it like it is. But some of the things they say, the advice that they give, that now back to the family life article, or article from CRU, they say that Mai and Whitlock offer ideas of what not to say. And you're supposed to not say things that invalidate or minimize the impact, saying something like this happens to everyone. Well, sometimes it's useful to wrap your head. I mean, I talk with young guys all the time who are, like, oh man, I'm frustrated because of X and Y. I'm like, okay, that's honestly, that's life. We all experience that. And frankly, what your experience is less. What your experience is less than what you're going to experience later. You have to have some of that context sometimes. Disbelief that it's racism, asking lots of questions. I'm sure they were stressed and you just happened to be there. How did you approach them? Those are valid questions. You shouldn't disbelieve it's racism because you shouldn't believe it's racism. That shouldn't be a question that comes in until there's evidence for it. You shouldn't bring in anything, any assumption of what the situation is, until there's evidence. Anything. Highlighting the innocent. You shouldn't highlight the innocent of intentions. I don't think that was that was their intention. That's a perfectly valid thing. If the evidence leads that way, you should go, wow, I get the way that you're responding to this, but that really doesn't seem to be their intention. And then, if you want to soften it, say something like, yeah, the situation, it doesn't seem like that was their intention. What about the situation made you think that was their intention? And those are great questions to ask, because you're now getting the person to think about it and to justify from the evidence their response. And that can a lot of times defuse people unless they're just being coddled. Continuing on, you shouldn't have personal defensiveness and need for reassurance from fear of being seen as a racism, or fear of being seen as a racist. Well, I'm sorry, but in this sort of framework, you already told us that just because of the color of my skin, that I'm automatically racist. So yeah, if I was following that ideology, I would have that fear in going into any conversation, because you're already telling me that I am. Now, what do they close this up with? They say to be sensitive with your desire to apologize. I don't know where this is coming from. They just suddenly jumped to just this assumption that you're going to apologize to the person, which really seems to be you're apologizing for your racism, your part in this systemic, the system that is racist, whatever it is. It seems to be what they're pushing here, but let's read it. Be sensitive with your desire to apologize. Therapist and author Shadeen Francis states in How to Talk with Your Black Friends About Race, which I have right here, it's a CNN article from 2020, a pro Black Lives Matter article, pro critical race theory. We're in this systemic racist culture, and it's all about how to confront your white friends and get them to speak up and get them to get over their disbelief of systemic racism, all sorts of things like that. But it says, an apology without action is empty. So to apologize for racism that is not new and that you benefit from doesn't actually serve the goal of being supportive. So let me read this again. So what is being said here? What is being quoted in the CRU article from this How to Talk with Your Black Friends About Race is an apology without action is empty. So to apologize for racism that is not new and that you benefit from doesn't actually serve the goal of being supportive. So not only do you need to apologize to this person who's coming to you and saying, oh, I'm a victim of racial trauma, regardless if the situation is legitimate or not, you need to apologize to them, but it's an empty thing that if you're just coming alongside them to help, you need to, you're not doing anything. Then you need to come alongside them, bind up your liberation with them, and admit that you are part of a beneficiary of a racist system and apologize. This is going in a weird direction. Continuing on, then it also feels like the other person's responsibility to somehow make that right by saying it's fine. So what they're saying there is, if you don't put your actions into your apology, if you don't apologize with your actions and your words, you are putting a burden on the person that has experienced this racial trauma to reassure you. You're making yourself the victim. So if you don't admit to being a beneficiary of systemic racism and apologize to this person that you're talking to, this quote person of color that experienced racial trauma, then you're making yourself the victim and forcing them to have to reassure you and say it's fine. Okay, question. Here's the question of the episode. Am I reading too much into that? Am I reading too much into that? I don't believe I am. I believe the pieces fit how I've described them. So let me know your thoughts on that, because I don't see another way to frame it. Those are the concepts they're bringing up. They're laying them out like they are, and when puzzle pieces fit together, it makes a picture. So let's conclude with this. Finally, show up and speak up. Silence furthers indifference. What did I say? White silence is white violence. It's a milder, they're not saying the same thing, but they're making a milder form of that argument. Finally, show up and speak up. Silence furthers indifference. Continue conversations with those who've experienced this kind of injustice and loss, as well as with the Holy Spirit. It's a spiritual thing. About steps you could take to love them well as both friend and advocate. Then they give you resources. You can go to Family Life Equips video. What does social justice have to do with making disciples? So to answer the question, where is CRU at? Have they learned anything? Well, no. In their family and marriage ministry, they're pushing systemic racism. They're quoting critical race theorists. They haven't learned anything. And the sad thing is, it seems like people don't care. They don't care enough to actually hold CRU accountable. And frankly, people are just kind of continuing to support CRU even if they disagree. We got to take this kind of stuff seriously. But what frustrates me so much about this article that we read is even the advice in it was just bad advice. It was condescending. It was only going to ever hurt the person you're trying to talk to. You don't talk to the person like they're a human being. You talk to them like they're a concept. And people aren't concepts. People are people. They're made in the image of God. They are humans. Talk to them like they are a rational person that you can have a conversation with. But don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do the oh, you sweet flower that has been hurt by this. Here, let me read from the script what I'm supposed to say to you. How is that helpful? How is validating their experience helpful? I still go back to that friend. I am so thankful that I was willing to stand up for them. I stood up for him in a moment when he wasn't willing to stand up for himself. And in the end, that is something that helped him. And he was able to realize that, and he was able to then benefit, grow. But nothing happened. No growth happens when you come to someone and you say, hey, the situation that happened to you, this was obviously racism. You should feel awful about this. You're valid in that feeling. And you know what? I'm a part of that. I did this to you just by the nature of my skin color. No, you're furthering, quote, racial division. You're creating a division in humanity that isn't supposed to be there. You're creating a division based on skin. That's wrong. That's wrong, especially in the context of Christ. Context of the church. We're talking about Christians here. We're talking about brothers and sisters, not whites and blacks. Brothers and sisters. Knock off the racism in the name of ending racism. Knock off the fakeness. Knock off the bad advice. Let's all grow together towards Christ. God bless you all. And if you found this useful or helpful or interesting, go ahead and share it with someone. Again, I say this all the time. I'm not looking for you to just blast it out there on social media. If you have someone specifically who you think this would benefit, send it directly to them. You know what? Because I'd rather you take the time to care about someone enough to say, hey, this was helpful to me. We were talking about X, Y, and Z, and I think this helps address it. Because you're engaging with that person. Now, you want to put it out there on social media, that's fine too. But I encourage you to have those human interactions when you share something. Anyway, God bless you, and remember, don't go woke.